If you will glance just very briefly at the syllabus sheet, the sheet that sort of gives us our topics for this week, you'll see it's kind of a broad statement that just says background issues in counseling. That's very broad. It doesn't tell you a lot, I know, okay? But I'm going to deal with a number of subjects today that are going to start to get us very close to what I call the nitty-gritty issues of counseling. Now, the things that tend to come up more often than others. Okay? And so by tomorrow, really later today, I think it's going to be very transparent how you can see how certain concepts connect with people's lives. By tomorrow, that'll be even more apparent. Okay? So today, picking up topics that help move us close, I went through a process of how to conceive of pastoral counseling. And I was actually, when I stepped into my first pastorate, I was young. I don't know what African standards are like, but in America, I was fairly young. I was about 24 when I was first pastoring a church. I had a number of years of training, and I had good training, but I had a lot, we all have a lot to learn, and I did too. And I had a rule of thumb in my early days as a pastor. My rule of thumb was, rarely would anybody seek my advice, but when they did, if I gave it, they would usually ignore it anyway. And I thought, okay, get used to the fact. But I don't think it was bad advice. I don't think so. But I still had to grow. Of course, other people have to grow as well. Anyway, today, work with me, be patient. Concepts that are very important. I'm going to be bringing Regina in at the second part. I should say, in light of this passage, Dr. Storelli will be coming in the second part of this morning. So I'm going to do sections 1, 3, and 4 today. She's going to do most of section 2, but they're all going to be moving closer and closer to hands-on helping people and the resources that are available. I want to thank you all for very thoughtful interaction yesterday. I went away, I don't know how you felt about yesterday, I went away thinking, I'm just very satisfied at the substance we were able to deal with and the kinds of questions and challenges that were coming. I was very satisfied. I hope you were too. Let me pray for us and then we'll talk. Father in heaven, I ask please that in this fresh new day, you would please bless us with your overwhelming presence. And may your Spirit fill us with a spirit of compassion, love, wisdom, and virtues that we all need, and that go with the fruit of the Spirit. But may we do this not only for its own value, because it matters that we have a relationship with you, but also when we are strong in you, we can be stronger for each other and for those you've given into our care. And so we pray for that, and may you advance that. We pray in Jesus' name this morning. Amen. Okay. Well, I'm going to start with a little section that I'm going to call simply, and I've labeled it here, sort of an overview of Christians and counseling. I want to talk just a little bit in this series this week about sort of the way various writers, specifically those with an eye towards religion, whether they are believers themselves or not, but just looking forward to what are some of the issues that come with counseling of people when, for the most part, we're dealing with professing believers who want some kind of guidance and help and interaction. And I'm going to be doing that in a couple of different ways this morning. There's a writer, the last name is Glock, G-L-O-C-K, Glock. And he suggests, I think this is a good way to go, that there are 5 dimensions of religious experience, 5 dimensions of religious experience. Being a religious person involves all of these things. And I like this holistic view that he has taken, and it fits well with the materials that we're doing. Remember our term Integrationist? We're trying to bring together directly the wisdom and knowledge of Scripture with the general revelation insights that come with practice and with research. We're trying to bring these two together, understanding that sometimes they seem to clash heads. That's going to be inevitable, but we believe often work and should work together as the revelation of God and the insights by general revelation, studying the Word, can come together. Anyway, Bloch says there are 5 dimensions of religious experience. Number 1, this is the easy one. Religion involves rituals and ritualistic practices. And it's most obvious when someone goes into a Sunday, and for most of us it's a Sunday morning worship, we're engaging in behaviors in ways that are unique. Okay? They're not necessarily quite like the rest of the week. Okay? So rituals and ritualistic behaviors. We most would just say public worship, let's say. Secondly, religious experience involves core doctrines and beliefs. Core doctrines and beliefs. I'm going to approach this from a negative angle briefly. I've heard people say, I'm sure you have, oh, all religions are the same. And that simply is not, it's just on the face of it, it's not true. That's an ignorant statement, all right? Religions have many points of overlap. That is true. We can see the outlines of the presence of God in other religions too. Yes, I'm good with that. But your religion, Christian faith, our religion, Christian faith, is making statements that are truth claims. We were looking at a number of these yesterday. We had truth claims about human nature, for example. And so that's part of religion. So belief in truth. A little quick aside, because trends in the West sometimes drift over to other areas, but we in the West, and America is a good example of this, are dealing with a massive wave of relativism. Relativism simply means everyone has their personal truth, but that doesn't apply to other people. So you personally might believe in something, or your people might believe in something, but as relativism goes, you don't have to see that truth. That's only their truth, and your truth is your truth. That's in my opinion, very dangerous, but I'll leave it at that. So, core doctrines, beliefs. Number 3, the personal experience component. The personal experience component. What you are thinking, seeing, believing, feeling, experiencing as you are relating to God. Okay? And ultimately, as Jesus would say, not only towards God, but if it's towards God, it should be towards your fellow human being as well. All right, that's number 2. Number 4, what he calls cognitive-based intellectual knowledge. Cognitive-based intellectual knowledge. Let me just simply say, this is something like saying the ways in which you understand something. That's a bit abstract, but I don't want to get sidetracked and spend too much time with it. But different religions say there are different ways to understand your faith. These differ somewhat. I've read, not a small amount, but a fair bit amount with regard to, for example, Buddhist experience. And the way many Buddhists approach things like suffering. And some of these are just different from Christianity. But I don't want to get bogged down on number 4, but I want to mention it because this was one of Bloch's points. Number 5, says Bloch.
Number 4 is
that was number 4. Yeah, the cognitive-based intellectual knowledge was number 4. Okay? And then number 5, which I want to add, is what he calls sort of the ethics and community life that come with that religion, the ethics and community life. And again, this is interesting, number 5, because I'm happy to agree, I'm eager to agree, many religions, for example, have something like the golden rule, right? The golden rule, do unto others as you want them to do unto yourself, unto you. You want to others as you want them to do unto you. That actually comes out in a number of religions as well. Ethical. We just say treat people decently, right? That comes out in, I can't say every religion, but I say definitely many. There's no question about it. So I'm pausing, and I like this framework of these 5 activities for a number of reasons, but one of them is that there is an attempt to be holistic, right? There's an attempt here to say to be a religious individual, to be human, because I think to be human is to have a sense of religion. Anthropologists, even who are so-called secular people, some of them, say mankind, human societies are incurably religious, right? If you try and suppress religion, it'll still come up. By the way, places such as the country of China, for many, many years have tried to suppress Christianity, especially in private settings. They've tried to suppress Buddhism, among other things even. And yet, the more you try and suppress, human beings show what is going to be natural to the image of God. The image of God yearns image for image. So you don't have to teach people to be religious. The question is, can you help them find? And that's something I've run into a fair bit. People will say to me sometimes of themselves, I'm not a very religious person. And I let that sit. That's their perception. But my thought is, no, you're in the image of God. We're going to be finding what that image in you. And that's Block is a holistic approach. We are complex creatures, simple in some ways, but all these things are involved. And if your private spirituality has no bearing on your relationships, then I question what's its value. So anyway, so that's insight from Block and kind of seeing a big picture on being human. Here's a fascinating statement. I'm going to quote it a couple times. It's very short, and then I'm going to explain why I like it so much. Psychology has a short history and a long past. Psychology, and I'm going to say psychology in a clinical sense, but also its related but distinct field of counseling, has a short history and a long past. That seems to be what we call an oxymoron, a conflict. I think it's a lovely statement, but you have to see why as we start to open this up. The fact is, it really isn't until the 19th century, when researchers, now certainly in Europe, I'm not denying it went on elsewhere, but what I would know because of my own cultural tradition, I'm more aware of the European tradition. Certain writers in Europe are starting to talk about this field that is called psychology. They coined the term. Now, you know that any word that ends with the phrase ology, right? Do you remember? It means what? That's from the Greek word logos, meaning what? Ology is the study of something, exactly. So psychology, pneumatology, theology, there's many, many, many ologies. And the word that's behind psyche, P-S-Y-C-H-E, let me write this on the board here so you have it fresh. The word psyche, you can do it with you can sound out the P or keep it silent, okay? That's the Greek word for the spirit or the soul. There's a bit of an overlap in meaning here. The spirit or soul, the psyche. And so the developing field that's going to come to be called psychology is a way of saying, look, let's talk not only about things like science out there in the field, okay, but let's also get at things that involve people's thoughts and feelings and the behaviors that tend to go with their thoughts and feelings. By the way, can I just make a comment? This is, again, one of these simple observations about people like myself. Sometimes I'm a slow learner. I'm happy to admit that. Think about it. Whatever is going on inside a person is going to show its effects on the outside. Same effect, okay? some simple examples. Someone who has very, very deep feelings, in some way or another, they're going to get expressed. If someone's inner feelings are chaotic and wild, and there's a turmoil going on inside their soul, it's going to tend to come out. It may come out in any of a number of different ways, but what is inside the person is what tends to then be shown outside. By the way, remember, similar thing Jesus said, okay? It's not what goes into a person that makes him unclean. It's what's coming out of the person. In other words, what's down deep in the soul. This observation of psychology, from my point of view, boy, sounds a lot like Jesus, even though I don't think they intended that, okay? And I'm going to talk here especially to men, because men often create a false dichotomy on this, splitting things where it's not a healthy separation. Many men will say something like this: men are, this is the claim, I don't agree. Many men say, men are logical, women are emotional. Okay? There is a little bit of truth to that, but the simple dichotomy, it's a very misleading concept. Very misleading, because then what comes out of that then is a derived concept that since men are logical, and logic is the ideal for all things, something which is tied to the feelings must be disregarded. But wait a minute. Let's look at the Psalms, especially the Psalms by David. Is David logical, or is David feeling-based? I want to suggest he's both. Thankfully, all right? I like to put it slightly differently. On the surface, men may seem more sort of organized, articulate, but believe me, men have deep feelings. It's just that they don't necessarily come out in the same way as women. Let me illustrate. Over the years, I've done many funerals, and I'm sure you have or you will. It's the way it goes. And it's very interesting because at a funeral, as in a worship service, and as in a classroom, I'm looking at faces, all right? And I'm seeing body language, and I'm seeing expressions, and so on and so on and so forth. And when I do funerals, I'll tell you a very, very common pattern, okay? The men sit there fairly fixed. Women vary, but are more likely to be the ones who are crying. So on the surface, I might say, well, women are emotional, men are not. But wait a minute, no. I'll tell you what I think is happening. I think for men, there is an emotional processing of this loss, okay, whatever the particulars were, but they will take longer. The women are like immediately in touch with what that loss means to them, and they're expressing it. The men need time to find what that is. My father passed away 6 years ago this summer, okay? I was very close to my dad. I call my dad my lifelong best friend. Great stories about my dad. I am still grieving my dad 6 years after the fact. Do you think I feel it deeply? Oh, you bet I do. But the way in which I do it is my own way. So we just want to be aware that men and women share so much in common, but the ways in which they work some of these details out are patterned to a degree by their gender. Okay, let's continue. So what's interesting about, I'm going back to this idea of psychology has a short history. It's really not until the 19th century, particularly with some European researchers who are starting to say, let's study the inner workings of the human mind. Okay? And since then, I've been coming up with various views and thoughts and analyses, and that's the area. But what's interesting, and this is the long past of this field, the related field of psychology and counseling, they're not identical, but they overlap, is that you've got very often a long time of clergy being what have been called the physicians of the soul. Okay? Right? When I have a break or an infection or a malfunction in my body, I go to a physician. The physician deals with the body. Primary. Although one of my doctors some years ago said to me, Jonathan, he said, sometimes I feel more like a priest than a doctor because people would share their personal concerns, which is fine, okay? But primarily, he's there to deal, or she's there to deal with the body. But think about the idea of the physician of the soul. All right? It may have implications for the body, but primarily it's dealing with the inner person, the thinking, the feeling, the emoting, the relationships, everything that goes with things that are not on the surface body, although the body is involved in all of these. So for example, one of the ways you can trace this is by going into church history, and the people who have written any of a number of things on theology from past centuries, okay, are talking about soul issues, no surprise. Often, unfortunately, they're doing it through the view of sins. It's an important part, okay? Sins, but they're at least trying to get at what's happening in human experience using this as the window. So, for example, a man, what's known as the Shepherd of Hermas, H-E-R-M-A-S, the Shepherd of Hermas, back in the 2nd century, I'll spell his name here, okay? The Shepherd of Hermas says, you know, in human experience, we wrestle with 12 sins. I list basic sins and discuss them. Okay, that's fair enough. In other words, he's saying human beings deal with brokenness. We do, we all know this. Whereas, for example, in the next century, another church writer by the name of Cyprian, these are interesting people, by the way. We don't have a chance to discuss them in detail, but we'll mention them. Cyprian says, you know, human beings deal with about 8 major sins. Okay, he's getting at human experience. That's a shepherd of the soul kind of thing. Augustine. 4th century. Augustine is a name you really want to know. Whether you remember the others or not, Augustine is I'm misspelling right at the beginning. I knew it didn't look right. Hang on a second here. Okay, there we go. Augustine. A-U-G, I can't read my own writing here. A-U-G-U-S-T-I-N. It's terrible. It really is. That's one of my besetting sins. Terrible writing. Augustine is a fascinating character. He lives in North Africa. Is Augustine a familiar name to you, by the way? He should be, because he may be the most famous African in history. Seriously. He may be. So Augustine's living in the 4th century in Carthage. Now, he's in North Africa, okay? He is a wild young man. I won't go into details, but he writes about his own life. He writes extensively. And he's writing at a time when more and more barbarian invasions are raiding Roman cities and Rome itself and pillaging, and it's a period of terrible violence, okay? Anyway, Augustine's a wild young man, but he has a mother who's a faithful woman. She prays for him, and he ends up traveling up north into Italy. And he hears about a famous preacher named Ambrose. And Augustine appreciated the quality of speech, right? What we call rhetorical style. And he goes up to listen to this guy Ambrose, and lo and behold, what happens is God basically has tricked Augustine, because when he goes to critique Ambrose and find out what's his teaching style like, Ambrose is leading the man of faith. Augustine moves back to Africa, spends the rest of his life in service in North Africa, shepherding, writing about Christian experience. If you take some time, go to the internet, find free resources on Augustine. He's got to be the most famous African ever, so please take some time. Anyway, Augustine, what does he say? I'm going to give you a quote from Augustine. This quote is worth gold. In short, it's insightful. Quote from Augustine. What the heart loves, the mind justifies, and the will chooses. I'm going to say it one more time. What the heart loves, the mind justifies, and the will chooses. Now, let me tell you why this is such a valuable insight. Please notice where he started in his sequence. Many people think that their life is oriented about what they logically assess. Augustine says no. That's not what's going on. He starts with the heart. Now, the heart's a metaphor, of course. But to say it's what the heart loves, he's saying deep inside human nature are inclinations that lead us towards certain things and away from others. They may be good or bad, or maybe something in the middle. But there's a human tendency or tendencies towards all sorts of things. All right? So what the heart is, what your inner self is drawing you towards, okay, then what happens is your mind tends to then say, I'm going to approve. These are good things, because how do I know they're good? They're good because I want them. That's important. This is insight into human beings. This is insight into yourself, insight into me. Okay? So it's where my inclination is going. My mind then wants to say, this must be good because I'm inclined this way, and therefore my will chooses to keep doing these things. One of the things that Dr. Strelli is going to be talking about with you at probably more than one point, is what she calls, given the population she deals with, criminogenic patterns. All right? On the one hand, you could say to someone who does a crime, look, choose tomorrow to not do the crime. That's not bad advice, but there's something deeper that has to go on. How do you help a person change those very deep internal tendencies that keep going in a certain direction? That's hard. That's really hard. Okay? Augustine is a great handle on things like that and many, many others. So we deal with people on inclinations. I have had, on occasion over the years, some very, very dear students. As I look back over the roughly 30-some plus years, 32 years I've been in teaching, I've had, I think, around 10,000, maybe 11,000 students in person at some point. And then online, I don't know, probably another 3,000 to 4,000 students. So I've interacted with a lot of people over the years. I have had just a couple students who have struggled with a life of crime as they grew up in a whatever environment that said that, hey, this is a good way to get ahead. And it's deep inside their patterning. I've had students who will take a semester, they'll do various courses, then they'll get arrested, and they'll serve some time in prison, and then they'll get out after they've served their time. And then they come back and they'll take some more courses, and we love them. And some of these people are lovable people, believe me. You love them. But deep inside, it's an Augustine problem. Their heart is oriented in a certain way. Now, that's the downside. Remember, there's also a good side. Because the Bible tells us your heart can be shaped in a way that leads you to want to love and serve and help others. We're just saying it can go either way. Anyway, let's continue. So we're back on this theme of psychology has a short history, but a long past. These people like Hermas, Cyprian, Augustine, and others, I could add a guy named John Cassian in the 8th century. He's also dealing with people's, what he calls vices. And what's interesting here, John Cassian actually goes on to prescribe, if you will, antidotes for different sin. If your sin tends to be this, then take these steps. By the way, a lot of writers do that. Okay? How helpful or not, I don't know. I'm not here to analyze, but just that they're dealing with human beings and their motivation. Okay. I'm going to jump well down the road to a guy who lives in the 1600s named Richard Baxter. I have not read all of Baxter's works. They are extensive. But Richard Baxter in the 1600s, okay, in Europe, Richard Baxter writes what he calls a Christian directory. Interestingly, it sounds like an odd one to me, but a Christian directory. It is, in my opinion, one of the first fully worked out attempts at advanced psychology and helping people with life. At least for its time, there's a lot to be developed later, but for its time is giving an amazing insight into how to wrestle with the things that befall and beset all of us together. For Richard Baxter's Christian, it's a massive work that he does, and I'll just mention it. And then we come on down to others today. And so it's in the 19th century when European theologians, well, some are theologians, but usually European researchers and philosophers are trying to develop some kind of a disciplined view of what is it to be human, the human soul and spirit, how we want to relate those. That's a tough area, and it's complex, and I think we'll be exploring it for the rest of human existence. Anyway, here's what we're getting at, okay? And here's what difference all this makes to you and me now. Because the question to ask is, okay, so why am I talking about this? Why does this matter to us now? And here's some thoughts that go with it, okay? So first off, this is going to lead me to ask some questions about whether you want to call them your parishioners or your counselees, or you want to call them your clients, depending on the relationship, you might use any of these terms. What difference does it make? I want to connect it on a practical level. One, I'm going to start with a short list here. Number one, it's asking how a spiritual intervention is going to help their overall well-being. It leads us to ask, how might my spiritual intervention help their overall well-being? I frequently start on exactly this point. Now, I only keep the question in my mind. I'm not necessarily telling the people I'm counseling that I'm thinking this, but I'm asking myself a question. Is this, whatever is troubling them, is this something I need to be dealing with because it's a matter of the soul and the spirit, or is it something somebody else can do better than me because I like to sometimes refer out, okay? And because I've done a lot of counseling with people with particularly depression and anxiety, I'm happy to keep feeding them things that are helpful, but I'm often bringing in either a therapist or a physician. And there's a fine line between those two. All right? So I see human beings as complex. All right? Here's my critique of much of Christianity in the West today. There are many Christians who say if you are suffering, if you're struggling with a problem, you need to pray more. I don't want to say to someone, you don't need to pray. I'm not going to say that. I don't believe that. But my question is that the issue? Maybe it is, but I'm not sure it always is. I'm going to take the other end of the spectrum. There are many companies that sell pharmaceutical products in America, and you can see this in the advertising they do. We have this pill, they give you various, anti-anxiety, there's various kinds, and say, take these and they're going to fix your life. That's what the advertising says. And again, I'm not closed, I'm open to the idea of using meds when that's really helpful, but we're not that simple. We're not simply people who need to pray more. We're not simply people who need more drugs. But there's a more complex thing going on in here. We've said, and you guys said this very nicely yesterday, when we're pastors and counselors, we need to be humble and cautious and thoughtful and maybe slow and careful to come to conclusions. Number two, it leads us to ask, how are my faith beliefs compatible or not with the person who's come to me for counseling? Because clearly all of us here are here because we're people of faith. Otherwise we wouldn't be here in this configuration today. We're people of faith. But remember, the client or counselee or even church member may not be where you think they are. Okay? Don't assume that because someone is a person in a church, they're necessarily a person of faith. I don't want you to judge them quickly, but I'm just saying, don't assume stuff. We need to approach them carefully and thoughtfully. Remember as well, and this is the beauty, I think, of being a pastor, very often, depending on who you are and where you are, there may be people who are coming to you for help because they've heard you are a compassionate and insightful person, but they're some other religion. Okay? And I'm going to open the door. I'm not going to close the door, but I'm going to open the door and say, you're going to have to figure out how you want to negotiate this difference. Your faith in Christ, and how does that come over to this here? I'm going to use an example of a friend of many, many years who illustrates this. Bear with me here. I met this friend, oh boy, my goodness, it's been over 27 years ago. She was a professor at a university. Actually, I was a student at the university, although I'm older than she is. But years after I was there, she was a professor there. She was a professor in the English department, and she specifically was hired to be what I would call probably an aggressively feminist writer who was also a practicing lesbian. This is part of her public testimony. I'm not violating any confidences, okay? By the way, she's published 4 books since she came to faith in Christ. But here's what happened, and she's told me about this process. She ends up in an interaction with a local pastor up in the city where I used to live in upstate New York. And she had written an opinion in a newspaper on some subject, and the local pastor writes a response where he disagrees with her, okay, in the paper. But what struck her was he wrote respectfully. And she said, she said in conversation, I'd never met a Christian who could disagree with me or disagree with my lifestyle, okay, but treat me respectfully. She said, I needed to meet that person. That was interesting, okay? Now remember, she's living a very interesting life at the time. So over the next year, they would meet regularly at a local coffee shop and just talk about life. All right? The particular man who was shepherding her was actually a pastor in my earlier life as well. Very influential on many of us. Now, for a year they met. And she said to me years later, if any time in that year he'd even mentioned the word church, I was out of there. Because I wasn't interested, and he knew that. So he was there, not because he was trying to talk her into the faith. He wasn't trying to talk her into the church. He was trying to do what she could tell he was about, respecting her right now. Very important, very important. And then when she was ready, she said, may I visit your church? And she visited his church. And then later on, a whole set of changes in life went out of that. But what's interesting, was helpful, and she's a friend of mine. I haven't seen her for a few years, but she's a friend of mine who's very, very different. By the way, today, she's married to a Christian pastor, which is interesting. Very interesting. I'm not saying she had to do it. I'm just saying that, in fact, is her story, okay? It's a fascinating story. And she talks about the aggression that she was being shown by so many religious people. And so someone who could say, I am not equal to you, but I'm going to treat you with respect. That's what we're getting at. So, but for at least that first year, they were, very, very different selves. Okay, number 3. Number 2. Thank you. I'm a theologian, not a mathematician. I can't count. Number 2 is the question. No, actually, this was number 2. Wait a minute. This was number 2. Just asking whether your beliefs are compatible with that other person. That was number 2. Okay? So that's what I've illustrated. For that year, the pastor and this woman professor, very, very much different lives. Okay, so you got a question, how compatible or incompatible? Just be aware of the situation. By the way, I had someone years ago, it was interesting, he called me up, he was a teacher at a local school. I didn't know the man, we talked on the phone, a very, very pleasant talk. He said, I am struggling with crushing anxiety, and he says, I have some friends who sought you out for counseling for anxiety. He said, will you spend some time? I said, sure. So I had to come over to church. I did a handful of sessions with him, okay? And then he said, thank you, I think you've helped me. I think I'll finish our sessions here, and I've never seen him again. Now, did that help him come to faith? I don't know. But remember the metaphor we talked about yesterday? I planted a seed. Maybe someone else will be harvesting the crop. So just to recap, to make sure our numbers are right, okay? So number one was the question of, does spiritual intervention overall promote the well-being of this person? Number two is the question, where do my beliefs and my clients' beliefs or my parishioners' beliefs, where do they line up, or maybe there's differences? Again, remember, sometimes people may have some significant differences from you that are not obvious. Just be aware of that. Number three, okay, what do I do, and this is a tough topic, what do I do if there is a difference between a clinical diagnosis and spiritual intervention? I'm going to illustrate what I mean by this. And by the way, this is a tough area, but it's going to be around, we're going to be dealing with this in a number of ways in the next week and a half, okay? Clinical diagnosis and spiritual intervention. I'm going to use this as an example. A longtime friend of my family is a woman, middle-aged woman. We've known her since she was much, much younger. And she is paranoid schizophrenic. Now, what does that mean for her? Well, it means, a couple examples. She sees people who don't exist. She sometimes has conversations with people who are not real people. Okay? She often feels like she is being watched and judged by secret authorities that are invading aspects of her life. Okay? It has a very, very bizarre set of behaviors that go from that. Now, she is also a Christian. As far as I can tell, she's a believer. I'm quite convinced she's a believer. But her faith here and whatever has gone into this whole situation, this crazy and uneven world of paranoid schizophrenia, okay, I do not know how to bring them together. I just know over the years I've had occasional interactions with her. I do what I can, but I'm also saying to myself, she needs far, far more than what I have to offer. And I'm not clear if she's able to. Sometimes she seems to go to people who can help. She is someone who needs chemical help. She needs medication. She does. No question about it. And unfortunately, every time she's on it and she feels normal after a while, then she decides, oh, I don't need the meds anymore. She goes off the medication and she starts to behave in very bizarre ways that are dangerous to her, and I fear maybe dangerous to other people as well. Anyway, so this tension, I feel often, clinical issues, depression, anxiety, various mental disorders, and the list is long, okay? And myself as a pastoral counselor, I need to distinguish what is an area I can deal with versus what do I need to leave her, if she's willing, and I don't know if she is, willing to seek help for that. These are the kinds of questions and issues that are coming up to me and to us all the time. My goal, but to take now where I was yesterday, my goal is to help with spiritual formation and the care of a soul, okay? But that doesn't necessarily equal other kinds of helps people need. As we said yesterday, I'm going to say again, pastors are very hesitant to refer people out, unfortunately. They're very hesitant to refer people out, and therefore, very often, they're attempting to help with something when we're not necessarily well equipped to do so. So I keep my foothold in where can I shape the soul? Where can I help them grow in the fruit of the Spirit? Think about it. The fruit of the Spirit, you know the list, right? Galatians 5, love and joy and peace and patience and goodness and kindness and humility and gentleness and self-control. These are qualities that ideally every human being should be growing in. Ideally. They're not just for some people, but for all people. Spiritual gifts, on the other hand, are particular to the person. Spiritual fruit are needed by all people. Developing a spiritual gift, this person's gift may differ from that, and so forth. Because we're all different parts of the body, and you know the metaphor from 1 Corinthians. My focus is primarily on the developing of, broadly speaking, the virtues of the spiritual experience of life. How can I help people do that? I start to touch on these other things because they have an impact, for example, on anxiety and depression, which we'll be talking more about in the next couple of days. So this is, what I'm doing here is presenting you, if you will, a kind of a set of frames by which to look at what we do as pastors, okay? And say we have a lot to offer. It's good and healthy, nevertheless, to recognize what areas we need to be careful at and say, well, there's other people who can bring those kinds of things in. And so growth in spiritual faith, here's a lovely book title of one of my favorite reads. A guy named David Benner, B-E-N-N-E-R, is a Christian counselor and psychologist. And David Benner has a book, I love that, just the title of the book, Care of Souls. Care of Souls. And that to me expresses what the Christian life is about and why counseling is definitely an important part for Christian workers such as ourselves. Okay? So once again, just to recap from yesterday, remember that by defining spiritual formation this way, it helps us focus on what we can and should be doing. Spiritual formation involves a process, right, of helping people become more like Christ, but doing so as well for the sake of others. Once again, spiritual formation is a process that is seeing us become more like Christ, and then doing so for the sake of others. And now, for our own sake as well, because it's our relationship with God. But it also has great impact on other people. I've said to my students, I've said to my young students, it's a good thing you didn't know me when I was your age, because I had a lot of growing to do. I don't know if you would have liked me back then. They may not like me now, right? But I know sometimes they probably would not have liked me way back when I was, even more to learn than I'm still learning now. Spiritual formation is a process. By the way, it's interesting. I've wrestled with this, and maybe you as well. I've wrestled with the fact that sometimes people who have what I would call very advanced spirituality have had massive fractures in their lives. I'll give you some examples. So I'll start with the Bible, and I'm going to come to modern day. I try to wrap my mind. I'm not even talking about Solomon for now. I'm talking about King David, right? You know the phrase. The Bible says he was a man after God's heart. Exactly. The guy had 8 wives. He had 8 wives. He's quite the polygamist. You realize that, right? He's helping shape our spirituality. We today sing his songs 3,000 years after the fact. Now, and his complexity of his household, all right, he's given too much to warfare. There's a place for warfare, but the Bible, God himself says to David, you've loved war too much. You don't get the right to build the temple. Okay, that's God's. I'm not judging the man. That's God speaking to him. I'm taking the history given to us in the Bible. He has about 8 wives. We know the names of at least some of them. All right. His wife situation is so chaotic. His kids are in rivalry. You realize this? And one of his kids will make a public statement by sleeping with another family member publicly so as to try and undermine David's kingship. And then they hunt him down and they kill his son. This is crazy stuff. This is crazy stuff. By the way, there's a help for us today, because I say to people, you may have a crazy situation in your life. You may have come from a family where there was a lot of craziness. All right? Good news. Bible is all about your kind of people. Right? And the good news is they didn't stay there. But remember, the process is going on. And David is making huge advances in certain areas, but not in others. This is what's interesting to me. And I don't know how to put this together. There are modern day leaders, and I am not going to use names because my purpose is not to embarrass or bring shame to a name of a modern Christian leader. But there are modern Christian leaders, there are names out there, you follow the news, you see it. And late in their life, things are coming out about these people that are horrible. Maybe how they treated their wife or their kids, or the way they carried on with other people. Their struggles with substance abuse. The list is long. There's a very, very famous, actually there's a couple of fairly recent Christian leaders, people whose works I have read and I've grown with. And a couple of them, for example, turned out to be child molesters. And I don't know how to put together these deep spiritual insights they have with the fact that part of their life has been absolutely destructive and hurtful to other people. Now, I can't answer for them. That's in God's hands, not mine. But what I can say is, God, could you please help me grow, sanctify me, develop me spiritually so that there is a consistency between what people see on the outside and what, in fact, I am on the inside. That we can see. Funny little experience on that very line. As I said, my father passed away about 6 years ago. Some years before he passed, by the way, he was 94 years old. He had a nice long life. Okay? Yeah, pretty cool. And he'd seen a lot in his life. And we were close since my childhood. I just was always close to my dad. And anyway, a couple of years before he passed, my father said to me, Jonathan, he said, when the time comes, will you speak at my funeral? And I playfully said, Dad, I'd love to. Okay? Okay. And I said, furthermore, Dad, I already know what I'm going to be saying at your funeral. He was surprised. He said, what? In fact, I already knew. Just ask me. I already knew what I was going to say. I said, Dad, at your funeral, I'm going to tell people that you were the same human being at home that people saw in public. And that's what I said. I said other things too. Because my dad had been a college professor for 60 years by the time he retired. 60 years. He had influenced a lot of lives. For a number of years, my dad had a television program in Western New York. People knew about a television program. All right? My stepmother, the woman my dad was eventually very, very happily married to for 20 years before she passed away, she had a TV program, and she was known to some degree nationally in the United States and up in Canada as well. People knew the name. All right? We'd be out going, people calling, hey, Dr. Watt, not referring to me, referring to my dad. All right? And I said, I want to tell people what they saw out there is what you were to me as my father. And I'm not saying he's perfect. He knows he's not. I know. But he was that kind of a man. That's what we want. The image here and the reality here to come closer and closer and closer and closer. Most of us want to look good in public. I do. I know you do. Okay? I don't want to be shamed or embarrassed in public, but I know there's a space here. By the way, quick aside, this is helpful do you guys do counseling, premarital counseling? Do people advise you before they get married? Do you advise people before they get married or not? Some of you do. Okay, some of you do. I do a fair bit because I work with students all the time. So I've got 2 weddings coming up this summer, which is kind of exciting. Anyway, I say to people, look, to him and to her, I say, look, you've got this image of this person here. Here's the reality here. You need to spend enough time getting to know them that what you are marrying is not simply your image of the person, which is partly correct, but not totally, but you want that as close to the reality as you can, so that after you get married, you will not have any big surprises. There's always surprises in marriage, but you're not going to have big surprises, because you've really understood the person. And by the way, that sometimes means you've really understood yourself. Understanding ourselves is almost as hard as understanding other people. Anyway, let me get a drink of water here and I'll continue. No, let me pause. Let me pause for just a second. Let me give you a concept and I want to ask your thoughts on this. The people we counsel, whether you want to call them a client, a parishioner, whatever, I don't care the term, whatever you do. People have their problems. But remember, a person is more than simply a collection of problems. And sometimes we get to know people best because the problems in their lives bring them to us. But that's quite okay. You could say God's got a blessed plan when things are broken. Nobody likes broken things in life. I don't, you know. But often those broken things have then become the bridge to something even better. And we would only have crossed that bridge if the problems first troubled us. Okay? But remember, a person, even someone who has many, many problems, is more than just a set of problems. Anyway, let me pause on that point. Tell me anything that is resonating with you this morning and what we've been talking about. I think a number of the people I've referenced may be new to you. A number of the quotations I think will be first time. We've introduced some of you, perhaps for the first time, to somebody like Augustine. By the way, Augustine has an entire book. One of his books is simply called Confessions. He talks rather bluntly about his own sin. It's almost embarrassing at points. But anyway, that's Augustine. What do you find that's useful? Because we say being a pastor is being in the trenches, right? You're at the front line of a spiritual war, sometimes of a literal war. What's working well here that you're finding that's helpful? I've got the mic here for you to speak if you wish to do so. What's useful? Nothing. Okay. We'll come back. All right. Let's press on. Go on to the next one. Let me erase this and get some space here. All right. Let me open up a couple of things that are going to be with us for a while today. I want to talk about a major resource set for life as well as for counseling, and it's what we call simply the wisdom literature of the Bible. Okay? And I first want to talk about what makes the wisdom literature what it is, and then I want to draw some things from it that are, in my opinion, in many people's opinions, very practical and helpful for counseling. I'm going to talk about this a good bit today. We'll probably start it now and then finish it this afternoon, but because we'll have that other section in the middle with Dr. Storelli. But for now, let me mention this. So the wisdom literature, I think you know this, comprises what? The book of Proverbs. Others are Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Some of the Psalms are also, and there's one other big book that's a wisdom literature book. The guy who suffered a lot. Job. There we go. Okay, that's the wisdom literature. The wisdom literature is a tradition of its own in the Bible. By the way, there's one New Testament book we also call wisdom literature. That's the book of James. But we're going to talk primarily Old Testament wisdom. Okay, so what's the wisdom literature? Why do we have a separate section called wisdom literature? What is it that makes it distinct? I like to put it this way. Law, which is what much of the Old Testament is, law says, do this and don't do this. Law tends to be black and white, at least on the surface, tends to be black and white. The way the ancient Jewish rabbis counted Old Testament laws, they said there were 613 commands or laws in the Bible, in the Jewish Bible, Old Testament. 613. About a third of them are positive, and about 2/3 of them are negative. Now, the positive ones have statements like, respect, love your mother and father. Negative ones, we all know there's plenty of those, from don't steal to don't murder, and so forth. You have all of those. So the law tends to work that way. Wisdom literature is, I'm going to describe with a couple words. It involves experience and practice. Okay? It involves experience and practice and sort of observing the way the world works. Experience and practice involving looking at the way the world works, and then you step back and say, in light of what I'm seeing, here's a good way to live. So the whole psychology of wisdom literature is very different from law literature. I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong. I'm just saying there are different ways to come at how to live life. That's what we're about. We're looking at ways to live life. Okay? In fact, here is the definition. I borrowed this. I didn't make up this definition. I love it. But I'm going to I just don't know who to quote. I just know I'm quoting someone who said, wisdom is the art of steering through life. Okay? Wisdom is the art of steering through life. I've got to tell you, going through the traffic in Nairobi, the art of steering. You Africans have some interesting artwork here. Like cars coming right at you in your lane, and you just hope they jump out before you. Yeah, that's, you know what I'm talking about. Whether you're the driver or not. You have some very interesting rules here. Yeah. You can write your own book, The Art of Steering Through Nairobi. Think about it. The art of steering through life rightly suggests, with practice, you can get better. You will sometimes learn from your mistakes. And guess what? That's all right. I have my earliest memory of my earliest wisdom literature experience. It had nothing to do with the Bible. I think I was about 4 years old. Okay? I look back, I've got to tell you, I look at pictures of myself as a little kid. I was kind of cute, okay? But I was also kind of dumb sometimes, all right? And it's amazing I survived my childhood. Anyway, my mother had been ironing clothes, and she leaves the iron on the table. And I'm curious. I wonder if the iron is hot. Now, I don't think to check whether it's plugged in or not. I thought the best way is take your hand, put your hand on the iron, see if it's hot. So I did. I pressed my hand on it, and I fried the whole front of my hand here. I mean, badly. Yeah, okay. My dad, back then, they didn't take you to the hospital. They just put medicine on and bound your hand with bandages. Okay, so a few days later, I recovered. That's very, very painful. So sometime later, my mother is ironing clothes, and she sets the iron up, and she goes in the other room to do something. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, last time the iron was hot, what are the chances of it being hot 2 times in a row? Best way to test, put my hand on it. Okay. All right. And I did it again. Yeah, I can't believe it. Okay. Hey, I was 4. I learned. I don't do that anymore. But my point is, it's a rough way to learn. But I learned. I learned to respect the iron. Yeah, exactly. We do this in life all the time. By the way, consider yourself for just a moment. Okay? Some of you are going to be people who respond well to law. Right? People guide you, do this, don't do this in life. And you're good with that. Some of you, I don't know, some of you are good that way. Others of us, and I'm clearly in this second group, have a lot of experimenting to do. And I don't know, that just the way God made me, I tend to want to experiment with something. I just do. I may decide later it was a good or a bad experiment. I don't mind failing a few times, as long as I can keep trying. Okay? I'm a language person. I love linguistics. Linguistics studies languages. So I work with classical Greek, classical Hebrew. I know a little bit of Anglo-Saxon English as it was spoken 1,500 years ago. Tiny little bit of Latin. I know modern German. Okay? And I decided a couple years ago I need to start studying Spanish. Because in America, more and more people are becoming rich. By the way, I think Swahili is next on the list. I'm serious. I'm serious about that. I think I may put that next on my list. So I've got a little program called Duolingo, and I'm learning Spanish. I use a little bit of book work, and I do a little bit of more Duolingo. And very often, I miss the exercise. I'm wrong on the exercises. But it allows you to keep trying. And that's what's helpful. That's what's helpful. Because if we can keep trying, get just a little bit better each time, this is the wisdom process. So consider this privately to yourself. Figure out, are you one of these law kind of people? If you are, that's fine. But many of us are the wisdom approach kind of people. So wisdom literature, let's give it a couple of major descriptors here. I'm going to put these on the board here. Wisdom literature, we've already identified the main wisdom books of the Bible. But wisdom literature thrives on experience. Okay? Try something out. I'll put this playfully. The law might say, don't hit your head against a stone wall. It's bad for you. That's law. Wisdom literature says, you want to hit your head against a stone wall? Go ahead. See what happens. Right? You'll learn. You will. You'll do it a few times and you'll say enough of that. All right? It's experiential. It relies on your experience, which means, this is closely related, it is experimental. There is a degree to which the way you do it comes with you trying different things, and you adjust slightly as each experiment has some kind of an outcome. I do a lot of this with people, especially moving between different cultures, in terms of how best to have a conversation with someone. And different cultures and different personalities tend to say you can or you should not meet people in this or that way. Okay, there are lots of stories about it. I won't give them to you right now, but lots of stories about just trying things out. How can I get a conversation going with people? All right, so that's the way it works. So experience, experimental, which then also relates closely to the fact that it is observation driven. Here's a famous proverb from the book of Proverbs. Go to the ant, you lazy person, and see how she works. Proverbs tells us a lot about the value of hard work. By the way, that's not the whole picture. Because the book of Ecclesiastes says you also need some good deep sleep that's satisfying. But Proverbs, and you've got to figure out, some people need to learn to work. Some people need to learn to rest. Each person is different. You've got to figure out where you fit in all this. So there's a lot of entry points to the wisdom literature. I'd say an awful lot of us will say one of our favorite books of the Bible is the book of Proverbs. It just is. Because you can apply these things. And you get to be an active tester, if you will, of the experience and see for yourself where it leads you. All right? Now, it's a tradition. And you know, a tradition involves wisdom that gets handed down generation after generation. Because things that worked in a previous generation, at least worth the next generation considering, hey, that may be for me as well. You have to try it out. That's what a tradition is. So in the wisdom literature, this art of steering through life, I'm going to draw a little diagram. I'm going to have to erase this, so I want to put the diagram high enough up here that everyone can see it. Okay? The wisdom literature has been likened to a two-story house. And I'll explain what we mean by this in this way. There is sort of, I'm going to put it this way, the main story, the main level of the house, and then there is the upper and roof level of the house. And the main floor consists of what we might call survival skills. Okay? Survivor skills, technical skills, administrative skills, and relationship skills. All right, there's different kinds of skills. And just take a couple quick examples. So some people are very, very gifted, for example, with their hands. Their technical abilities are frankly amazing. They're able to do things with a mastery, whatever it is. Maybe they work on an automobile engine. Maybe they work on fixing your teeth. You know, lots of different ways to go about this. Maybe they're an electrician or a plumber. They just have a way of doing things very, very well. Okay? And I had a washing machine a couple of years ago that broke down. I once sort of fixed a washing machine, but this was a different kind of breakdown. And I take it over the phone. I don't get how this works. I called in someone who was an expert. Within 1 hour, he had it fixed. Everything was done. I thought, you are a magician with your technical skills. You know how to do it. I don't. I don't get it. So different kinds of skills. Everyone has some blend of these kinds of skills. I know people who are very, very, very good at cooking. That is a skill I don't have. I can cook. I can also burn things. Whereas some people, like that person back there, who are excellent at producing some wonderful food, and they can do it again and again. That's not. I can survive, but I'm not excellent. So administrative skills, and it's interesting. You know, in the Bible, you get some interesting examples of these. Just to give you a feel for it. Take Solomon, for example, who had excellent administrative skills. He was a judicial or judicious person. And they give us a little story to illustrate this. Obviously, there were many, many more stories about him, but this is just to give it to illustrate. Two women are arguing over who owns the baby. Is that my baby or is that her baby? Right? And so he says, well, very simple. We'll just divide the child in two. And he knows, and this is he had to have been watching faces. He had to have been watching faces. Because the mother, the real natural physical mother of the baby, would have that reaction. What? No. You can't do that. That's my baby. That's how he knew. That's a wonderful skill. It's a wonderful skill. So that's the administrative and judicial skill. The stories of people who were involved in the building of the temple at Jerusalem include many stories of people with great technical skills and building skills. Anyway, enough examples there. Now, that's sort of the main floor. Okay? And then what happens is that is all built on, I'm going to put a basement level down here. Okay? So we're going to put main floor, basement, what we call simply the divine order of things. God founded the world on wisdom. That's what the book of Proverbs says. Quite a statement, really. God founded the world on wisdom. And I'm going to tell you how this helps me with counseling. Because some people are attuned to the idea that the various kinds of skills, and I'm just going to put at the top level here, all the extras that go with life. I'm going to leave that pretty vague, okay? But that ultimately, wisdom is working with the way God made things to work, and there are things that are going to be inherently good patterns. To have a good work ethic, good pattern. What are some of the other things that come out of the Proverbs? Be honest with your friends. That's a good pattern. If you have close friends, choose them wisely. Good pattern. By the way, we can be close to people who are problem people so long as we are clearly in control of ourselves. Just a thought there, okay? Being considerate of how you train your children. Good pattern. Be conscious about it. Try to do a good job with it. Right? I once said to one of my sons when he was an adult, I said, I think sometimes I maybe was too harsh with you when you were a child. By the way, to this day, I still think I was too harsh at some points. And it was interesting, his response. He said, Dad, he said, I needed to be raised. Because he knew he was a challenging child. Okay. So I admitted my shortcomings. He kind of admitted his shortcomings. And there was a good meeting of souls. All right. So we gain, we practice, we learn, we redo. But we're trying to be in touch with a divine order. Divine order says other things, such as there are big picture administrative things of life, whether it's in the government or in the household, and there have to be people who can see how these things operate and can make them work well. Some of you have these. By the way, very often, pastors have these kind of administrative abilities. By the way, if you're not good in this area, what do you need to do? You have two options. One is to develop some of these skills. You have options, right? You learn. The other is to bring close to yourself people who do have these strengths and give them the freedom to really exercise them. It's a combination of both, Steve, right? Because God's given us all different gifts. So the wisdom literature, in my opinion, leaves many, many great possibilities open for all kinds of things. It's blunt stuff, by the way. It talks about wise people, obviously. It also talks about fools. Most English translations say that the fool does X, Y, and Z. I want to suggest, if you read the particular Proverbs carefully, there are actually two different kinds of fools that are involved. This is helpful. It's helpful for counseling, too. There are some people who we call fools because they are stubborn, unteachable, bullheaded, self-determined with they will not listen to anybody else. That's one kind of fool. And the Proverbs, in effect, say there's no hope for that kind of person. Sometimes I have shied away from counseling certain people even when they seem to be open to what I have to offer as a pastoral counselor. Because as I've gotten to know them over the years, I'm thinking, I don't think this person wants help, really. They may appear to want help. But I don't think I'm going to be doing anything good. And this is not often. But there are times I've said to myself and I've said to the person, I don't think we're going to spend time talking about these issues. You have to figure it out yourself. I hate getting to that point. It's not often that I do. But there are times when I simply say to myself, from what I am seeing in this person, they are stubborn and self-determined and downright hurtful. And I'm not going to go anywhere with it. I'm going to just leave it goodbye. You know, God love you. I know He does. I don't. At least not very well right now. Now, good news. There's another kind of fool. There's the second kind. The other kind of fool is the fool who makes mistakes, but because they're young and inexperienced. And with time and practice, they will eventually, will learn how to do good things and do them well. And I'm going to give you one very, very good example of this second kind, because this touches on a lot of our lives. As I said, I have 4 children, particularly with respect to the 2 younger boys. Okay, they're now in their 30s, but I'm thinking back when they were growing up. I love them dearly. I was close to my kids, let me be clear. But these 2 young boys had a lot of growing to do. And they would get I give them each week just a little, I didn't give them much, give them a little bit of pocket money, or they could go and do jobs for people and make some money. And they were into various kinds of games, either sporting games like paintball, or collecting like Pokemon cards or things like that. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, I don't know how, like, this or that interest that they have, is it really going to make a difference in their lives? Does it really offer them something that they think is good? But I've been very careful not to criticize my kids. Okay, I criticize my kids if I really, really feel I have to say something. But by and large, I gave them freedom for this reason. I figured, as they're growing up, getting money or earning money, they need the experience of owning the decisions. And that way, as they get older, I know this is going to happen. They're going to mature. And their patterns of decision-making, including how they spend their money, is going to change. But I've got to give them that room to grow. And it was very interesting. The other day, I was over at one son's house, and he has a son and a daughter, okay? And his son, who is about 5 years old, is now playing with some of the same Pokemon cards his dad was playing with 30-some years ago. I thought, interesting. And I'm thinking to myself, 5 years down the road to this kid, he's not going to have the interest there. He's going to move on to something else, which is fine. We've got to give people room to practice and grow in life, particularly our children, and especially the parishioners in our church. People are different levels of growth and experience. I know you know this. I know you know this. But I'm just saying it's so tempting to want to force people to a quick outcome on our schedule. And human growth is like the development of fruit. We all know fruit usually takes months to develop, from the flower to the little tiny bud of fruit to the fully formed and fully grown fruit that is edible and delicious and pleasant. It takes months to get there. That's an image for human development. It takes years to get to where we need to be. Thoughts on this? And use the microphone, please, if you would, for sharing these. It's on.
Do I need to tell them what I perceive to be the right thing first, so that in the event they choose for themselves, I've told them from my knowledge, this is what I think is right, but then you can make your decision?
You certainly can do that. Yes, that's a very fair question, right? So, in other words, you may say to someone, I'm not sure whether this is going to help you down the road, but at least what you've done is you've involved them in now consciously thinking about, oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, great question. Thoughts for him? Yeah.
Yes.
You come forward, or I can throw this back towards you.
If you throw it, I won't catch it.
Okay. And we break in 3 minutes. You can have all 3 minutes if you want.
Thank you. You're so generous.
I'm very generous. Yes. I've learned generosity is a good practice.
So, one of the things that I have found is that when we discover something for ourselves, we're much more bought into it as opposed to somebody prescribing something for us. And one of the things that I found is that a lot of ministers like to be prescriptive. Do X, Y, Z, and it'll all get better. Right? Okay. But if they could do X, Y, Z, they would have already done it. They would have already thought about it. They would have already processed it. And I'm going to tell you a quick story, because I think people have to process themselves. Okay? So, as we said, I work in a prison. Okay? And I was counseling a man, this was years and years ago, who was a hitman for gang. And he said to me, I like this. I don't mind being in prison. I don't mind being in the restricted housing unit. I like that people respect me in his eyes. I think he was more feared than respected. Okay? But he called it street cred. Okay? And I said, well, then we're done. You have what you want. And he said, aren't you going to tell me it's wrong? And I said, well, it's your want. It's not my want. Okay. And he said, well, I'm having nightmares. Oh. So you want to sleep better. That's a different want than the want that you have for being a hitman, right? And I said, what are you having nightmares about? And he said, about the people I killed. I said, well, it sounds to me like your two wants are in opposition of each other. You decide what want is more important to you. And then when you decide, you come back and talk to me. And he took about a month to decide. And he decided he was going to leave the gang. Okay? But if I would have said to him, that's wrong, you're going to, you know where. Okay? I thought it. Wouldn't we all think it? Okay? But if I would have said that to him, what do you think would have happened? judgmental, okay? And he would have not probably come to the same conclusion that he did if I gave him space to work it out. Is that making sense?
Yes.
Okay, so we can be prescriptive, but we can also give people the tools, and we're going to talk about that in the next section. So I'm very big on tools, okay? So, and like I said, we'll talk about that in the next section, but you can give somebody the tools to help them work it out themselves. What's the story about giving a man a fish versus teaching him to fish? You know that? What is it? What is it? Do you know? So if I teach to if I give a man a fish, he's eaten for one day. If I teach him to fish, he can eat every day. He can fish for himself. Okay? So if I give somebody the tools to work out their own issues, they don't need me anymore. Okay? But here's the problem with us as helpers sometimes. We like being needed. We like being needed. Okay? So we like it when people come to us. It makes us feel important. Okay? It makes us feel like we're relied upon, we're essential. Okay? We would be obsolete. Do you think people have so few problems that we would ever be obsolete? No. Yeah. But we feel that way sometimes. So, okay, we want to work ourselves out of a job. We won't, but we want to. So the goal is for people to give them the tools to work through so then they can help others. And that's how mission works. So us here is giving you tools so you can go out and work. I'm not putting myself out of job teaching you, am I?